welcome everyone to the second track on today's technology track. Sorry, it's a little early for me too. So we have two amazing speakers for you today. David Dietrich from the University of Washington and Bruce Dang from the Microsoft Corporation. And they explained to me what they do, and I've since forgotten it. So I'm going to let them do a little bit fuller introduction. So please welcome David and Bruce.
Thanks. Again, Dave Dietrich, University of Washington, currently a affiliate principal scientist with the Applied Physics Lab. A lot of you may know me from the 1999 and 2000 distributed denial of service attack analyses. We've heard a couple of speakers so far talking about punctuated equilibrium and how things sort of evolve over time in little fits and spurts. What we'll be talking about today is another one of these sort of not quantum leaps, but a change in the paradigm in how malicious software is controlled. We're going to start off with a little bit of intro on reverse engineering with Bruce Dang. Works at the Secure Windows Initiative at Microsoft and is a pretty skilled reverse engineer. So Bruce? Oh. Bruce is going to start off with just talking about some practical techniques for reverse engineering that you would apply to this kind of malware. As I mentioned a little bit ago, there have been previous kinds of command and control, so I'll kind of briefly go over that, talk about Nugache, some details that haven't really been talked about publicly to date, and finish off with some of the implications for response. So with that, I will hand it over to Bruce.
Do I need to have this on?
Yeah.
Okay. Hi everybody, I'm Bruce. I work in the Secure Windows Initiative group at Microsoft. We deal with software vulnerabilities, so if you found vulns, please send it to secure@microsoft.com and we'll probably triage it. So I'm here to talk about some basic reverse engineering methods that you can use to quickly analyze malware. Most of this stuff, of course, is not new because reverse engineering has been around for long enough. And most people should probably know some of these methods, but I thought I should probably repeat them because they're very important. And actually, a lot of the information that Dave will present in the second part are came directly from applying these methods. So the first thing I want to talk about is generic unpacking methods, because all malware these days, all respected ones at least, are packed. If you're not packed, you might as well not write it. Yeah. And the second part is actually important, is recognizing important functions. This is actually what separates a reverse engineer from somebody who can read assembly code. So when you look at assembly, it's like 10,000 lines of instructions. You're not going to read them through every line by line. It's very time consuming, and you might not be able to understand them all. And the other part is identifying crypto mechanisms. So lots of new malware these days will use encryption for the communication. They're not going to use plain text, or they're not going to IRC, directly use IRC anymore. So you can't use TCP dump and sniff network traffic anymore. And the final part is just patching, for and dynamic analysis. Generic unpacking methods. So most of these, I should emphasize that these are manual unpacking methods. So the first thing that I would do for when I'm trying to unpack something is I try to identify the unpacking loops, because they have to unpack them somehow, and these will usually have to go through loops. So what you have to do is figure out where these loops are happening, and this is pretty important. And most of them, they'll involve those instructions. So you look for these code patterns. And figure out where they start and where they end, so you can step in and out of them. Anyways, or you can be lazy and just look for the call and jump to these registers and pray that you're right. You'd be surprised how often they work. Like literally, if you use UPX, you can find one of these and literally press F2, set a breakpoint, and run, and it'll hit it, and you'll unpack it. But again, UPX is not even a real packer, so. But most of the easy packers that work this way, the hard ones, you need more work because they have anti-debugging mechanisms, which you have to identify before and fix before you even reach these points. The second method is to set memory breakpoints on certain memory regions, because the way the unpackers work is they'll unpack, they'll write to a region, then they'll jump to and execute there. In fact, I think this is how Olibone works, and a lot of automatic unpackers work because it's a lot easier to do. But then again, sometimes they don't work. And the third method is to guess what library calls might be made. For example, so if I'm looking at a bot component, I know they'll have to make socket connections, right? So what I'll do is I'll set a global breakpoint on WS2_32 socket, and when it gets hit, I know that the binary is probably already unpacked. So when it breaks, dump the process and then open up in IDA and then do my static analysis on there. So the more information you know about your target, the more, I guess, the wiser decision you can make about which breakpoints you should set. And finally, actually there's another method that I should probably mention, several other ones. One of them is to do, I guess you can do EIP profiling, which is what Eero Carrera did. I don't know if he's here, but what he did was he made a graph of, he traced EIP over a period of time, and what the graph looks like, it's like, zzz, and then there's going to be a constant line after that, because that's, and the straight line after that is where it's unpacked. And you can use that method to guess where the regional entry point as well. And last, if you don't know how to do any of this stuff, just step through one instruction at a time and spend maybe a day going through the unpacker, and then maybe at the end of the day you can write a static unpacker that will do the job for you. But yeah, I mean, if you can't do it, just do step through one instruction at a time. And this part, recognizing important functions. So when you look at a large piece of malware or any large binary, you'll literally have thousands of functions, and the functions are huge, right? And you don't know where to start. I guess you shouldn't start at main, because there's a lot of Windows startup functions that you don't care about. And again, you don't want to waste your time, especially for incident response. You need to know exactly. You need to have a pretty good idea where you need to spend your time at. So what I usually do is, again, for botnet component.
Investigating that. The fact that it doesn't work.
Uh-oh. Okay. Sorry. Can you guys hear me?
Right there.
Okay. So you should get familiarized yourself with common call chains, especially in socket applications, whether they'll create a socket and then bind to it, or then they'll connect, depending if they're a server or a component, blah, 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 blah. And so you should figure out where these things are, and yeah. And also for common Win32 API calls, like create file, read file, write file. These are all file handling routines in Win3. It's very common. I think most malware will use them, like 99.9% of them, at least user-oriented ones. And the next, and you pay special attention to like the send and receive calls, because send and receive will actually send and receive buffers from the wire, right? So. And one of the parameters to send is actually a buffer, and say so if you know that one of the parameters is a buffer, you can trace backwards to how that buffer is created before it's being sent, so you have a better idea of how the data is crafted, especially if it's encrypted. So the next part is like, so if they use encryption, obviously by the time it hits the send, the buffers are encrypted. So what you see on the wire is like a whole bunch of garbage, so it's completely useless. So what you need to do is like set a breakpoint. Actually, don't set breakpoints. Figure out how this buffer is being created by going backwards, and rename the function, like XX encrypt buffer or something like that. That's what I usually do. The same thing applies for receive and most of the other ones. So it's important to remember the parameters to functions. Also, the fourth one is to use cross references. I should mention that all this method only applies when you have the binary unpacked, because if you have it packed, you won't see any of this stuff, and you won't see any strings. So all these methods only apply to unpacked binaries or stuff that's not packed. So most of the time they'll have, if it's an IRC component, they'll have IRC protocol tags, so like nick, join, and most of the time you can just like press N. Either if you just select the function and press N, and you say xxx underscore IRC component or something like that. And then same thing with FTP, HTTP. You can figure all this stuff out fairly easily. And the thing is, you make sure that you use cross references to your advantage, because once you identify something and you're very certain, or like have a high degree of confidence as to what it does, then you can ignore that function later. You can say, okay, well all this does is just do IRC stuff and send stuff out. I don't have to look at it. So you reduce the amount of unknown that you have to go through. And trace backwards as well. So here's a quick example I just took from the examples. Here you see, can you guys see the disassembly listing? So here you see they receive a buffer and they do a string strcmp against list, and then if it is, then they go to this thing, which is actually a handler. And the same pattern here, compare against retrieve. These are actually FTP commands, and blah, same thing. So you know that FTPD_2 and FTPD, those are command handlers. So you can ignore them. They could be like, I don't know, maybe 100 lines of disassembly, but then again, you don't have to look at them anymore because you already know what they do. And you know, of course, when you open up an IDA, they don't give you friendly names. So it's like call sub 1234. You rename them FTPD, and it's a lot easier for you to figure out. The next one is to identify crypto mechanisms. Most of the malware these days will use crypto, so that you can't sniff the traffic over the wire and do analysis on it anymore. So you need to identify them. You can do this with scripts or without scripts. You can do it with an IDA plugin, FindCrypt, and also support of it for OllyDBG. And that's also the CryptoCanal plugin with PID. All these, they will identify hashing algorithms and symmetric algorithms. But they can't, anyways, yeah. But sometimes they don't work, so you have to do it manually. FindCrypt, I think, was like released last year or something like that. So before that, I guess there's no plugin, so you have to do it manually or you wrote your own. Anyways, for symmetric algorithms, what you have to, the trick is, because all this stuff applies to manual techniques. So for symmetric algorithms, what you should identify is the SBox values, which are like this huge ass array of integers that they use in the AES algorithm, and nobody changes them because people don't know what would happen if you change them. So. Yeah, and also, so when you identify these integers, then figure out who's referencing them and the operations being done with them. So they'll be like matrix operations. Also understand that with AES, you have a setKey function and encrypt function. So when you identify the core AES function, you can actually figure out what the key is by setting breakpoints to those functions, or you can write your own. You can dump the private key at those points. This also applies to DES and any other symmetric algorithms. For asymmetric, it's a little bit different because there's no SBox values, and obviously none of those plugins none of those plugins will identify RSA. There's really no systematic way of identifying it. So the way I do it is identify the public exponent, which is usually 65537, which is 2 to the 16th plus 1. It's very common, and also identify functions that do large integer multiplication. That's what I usually do. And for hashing functions, usually I do look for huge functions with move and a whole bunch of arithmetic instructions. So for MD5, it's the common call chains like MD5 init, update, and final, and you can pretty much automate most of this. The next one is for pseudo random number generation. A lot of malware will use this. They're not going to use the default. Sometimes they use the default Win32 random number generator, but sometimes they write their own. And of course, IDA is not going to recognize it, so you need to figure it out. So the way I usually do it is because most of these random number generators, we need a seeder, and most of them they seed it using get tick count, get cursor position, time. Those are the most common seeders, and these functions will typically have two arguments. One is the upper bound, the other one is a lower bound. So look through them. In fact, in this Nugache sample, they use random number generation for quite a few things. Like, for example, to pick the random port they're going to listen on, and pick a random message they're going to spam people with, so that they don't send the same message every single time. Here are some examples. For example, this is actually the random number generator, and here you see them using get tick count and get cursor position. I actually decompiled this whole thing, but I guess we can't show it here. But anyways, once I identify this, this is a random number generator, you press X on it, you'll see how many people use it. And you'll see all the functions called to all like the email, the spamming routines, because the way this bot works is that they have a list of messages and lists of email addresses they send out, and they pick them randomly. And that's what they use for, that's what they use a random number generator for. This one is example of the AES core routine. You see all these array operations, and you see no jumps. All these are moves and XORs and SHRs. So moves and arithmetic instructions. Next one, this is actually an IDA script that I wrote. This is the MD5 core routine. It has 780 instructions, and only 17 are unique. And actually, most of them are all arithmetic ones. And you only see one jump here. This, you wouldn't, a normal function, you wouldn't see this. Same with AES. You got like about 2,000 lines, 2,000 instructions, and only 19 unique ones. And again, most of them are arithmetic instructions. I wrote this actually using IDC, plain IDC, without using IDA Python, using, I guess, an undocumented. It's in the IDC manual, but they don't tell you how to use it, which is set hash. Using hashes. It's like set hash key or something like that, but they don't tell you how to use it. And if you ever use it, the usage is very similar to the array functions. So you don't have to send in a support email to ilfac@datarescue.com. Anyways, for patching, all the methods I just explained are exclusively for static analysis. There's no dynamic. They're for static analysis only. Here, sometimes you want to do dynamic analysis because one, you're lazy, and two, sometimes there's a lot of assembly to go through and you don't want to go through them all. So dynamic analysis is good. So what you do is you have to figure out what are the important functions that you need to set breakpoints at. And this is why it's important to do static analysis before you do dynamic analysis. Sometimes you want to patch the function as well to do something else. For example, in this, I think in this case, I patched the AES routine so that every time when they encrypt something, I just dump out the key so that later I can reuse it to decrypt stuff if I wanted to. Yeah. And there's a whole bunch of different ways you could do this, but the easiest way to do is find a 5-byte zone and do a long jump from there. Long jump is 5 bytes long. So that's pretty much it. To sum up, reverse engineering is non-trivial sometimes. But it's a very critical skill to have for incident response because you need to have a fairly concrete understanding of the sample before you can jump to conclusions about it. Unfortunately, it's not taught in school. I don't know why. They just teach you how to read assembly, but they don't really teach you how to reverse engineer. And static and dynamic analysis, they should complement each other, especially if the sample is C++, because it's very difficult to reverse engineer C++ code because you use all this like virtual function, object-oriented, blah 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 blah. It's hard. But I would certainly recommend that you do static analysis first before you do dynamic analysis because you just jump in a sample and set random breakpoints. I mean that's very foolish, right? Because you really don't know what you're doing, and sometimes the sample could have all these trapdoors that you haven't gone through. So it's important that you do static analysis first, so you have an idea of what you're looking at when you're doing dynamic analysis. And what can you learn from reverse engineering? Well, you learn a lot of things, which Dave will talk about here. Yeah.
All right, thanks, Bruce.
Yeah.
So I'm going to kind of quickly go over what's led us up to peer-to-peer malicious software, especially one that has some hardening of the communications, which requires the kind of reverse engineering that Bruce is just talking about. We've seen with things like Agobot. Agobot was maintained in CVS, comments, people were sending in bug reports, they were patching things. So there is more of a software engineering focus to the development of these tools these days. So you'll see code reuse, and then one other thing that I'm seeing a lot of recently is the techniques that are successful are being reverse engineered and then coded into new code. So you'll see multiple different kinds of malware, multiple different groups using the same techniques. So there's this convergence of features, convergence of tactics, which is making a lot of the attacks today much more structured, much more complex, which requires doing quick reverse engineering, as Bruce was talking about, to try and deal with it. I'm not going to go into this in much depth, and unfortunately it looks like you can't quite see this, but the paper published in Login in December here is available. on the Usenix website. Back in '99, we started seeing handler agent distributed denial of service attack tools. They were specifically for DDoS. There's a symmetry here. Where's the laser pointer? There's a symmetry here in the command and control going from a set of handlers to a bunch of agents. Each of these diagrams has the same number of agents. IRC was popular, and that was actually the target of most of the attacks in '99. So a lot of the tools have migrated to using IRC. And today, botnets, you hear about botnet this, bot that. The term bot is becoming anything malicious that's controlled in a distributed way, which totally blurs things when you start talking about peer-to-peer that does not use IRC at all for command and control. But in the peer-to-peer world, you see what looks to be more of a random set of connections, and it's not obvious at all what the chaining is between the attacker initiating the commands, propagation of the commands, and then the actual agents doing the attack. I mentioned the convergence of techniques. This morning, Dan Gear was talking about NIMDA having 5 propagation vectors. Those tended to mostly be direct attacks, exploitation of a remotely available service, exploitation of another piece of malware. They were also using propagation through email. So you can see this continuum here of technical attacks, direct host-to-host, to social engineering attacks that are very indirect, sometimes multi-step. And in the case of Nugache, all 5 of these different mechanisms were used. This number 4 here, I've seen used by several kinds of malware. Storm is being propagated through this mechanism, sending out email or using blogs, trying to entice somebody to go download a program, which is a dropper that then installs the malware. And in the case of Storm, there are multiple components, so you get multiple pieces of malware in series. I'll talk about this number 5 here in a minute. A variant of this was seen a few years ago, but this is a combination of click fraud using a botnet with social engineering, using a dropper in an indirect way. Nugache has been around actually for probably, well, the earliest that I know of it being discussed in sort of private circles was October of 2005, I believe. And I started looking at it in April of 2006. It used to be a fixed port, TCP port 8, which was pretty easy to catch. And now, as Bruce was saying, does random number generation to choose its high numbered listening port. Every bot ends up with its own port number. All the command and control goes over this peer-to-peer channel. It can still use IRC, but most of the time it's through the command and control channel. And they're using pretty sophisticated crypto, RSA key exchange to create AES session or RINDL session keys, RINDL being the candidate AES name, using 256 bits for the key. Also includes an embedded 4096-bit signing key, so the commands are signed, the binary itself is signed, hardening it from takeover. It also uses sort of object-oriented scripting language. It looks kind of like JScript.net or JavaScript. And as we'll see in a minute, if you're doing traffic analysis, you can't see anything because the command and control is encrypted, and you see so few of the bots in the network that you can't get a good picture in any reasonable amount of time. This is a comparison, and there's another article here. I believe Usenix just made these publicly available. This paper used to only be available to Usenix members. And it compares the use of peer-to-peer for command and control between Storm and Nugache. And the things in red are the things that worry me as an incident responder trying to figure out how to mitigate the botnet. And you'll see that Nugache actually has a larger number of threatening things that it implements. Storm has this architecture I was talking about a minute ago where you install the first program, it uses overnet to go out and find the servers where it's going to download the secondary components and then downloads the secondary components. Those can change over time, so that's a little bit more flexible. Nugache is just one big monolithic binary. But updating, as we'll see in a little bit, is automatic. And it's not easy to detect the peer-to-peer traffic because of the use of RSA key exchange. And I'm not going to labor on this one very much, but there are a lot of misconceptions out there. There were some articles that came out. I gave a talk at Information Security Decisions in December, and some articles came out in January saying Nugache is overtaking Storm, and it's the reason that botnets are getting really cheap, which is not really the case. So we'll probably be releasing a tech report that has much more details than I'll be talking about here in the next week or two. Actually took out the slide on antivirus. Storm is not really well detected by antivirus, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the network analysis to try and understand it at the beginning. As Bruce was saying earlier, reverse engineering is not simple, so I have not been spending my full time in analyzing this and relying on reverse engineering resources that are somewhat limited. So if I would have had some people dedicated to do the reverse engineering early on, we could have gotten much farther, much faster. This is a graph showing just unique IP addresses as seen over time, just monitoring traffic to one bot. And there's a fairly steady growth curve here. The total number is like 1,972 or something like that over a 1 month or 2 month? Almost 2 months. And you'll see a little spike here, which we'll learn about in a second. This is an animation of 7 days worth of observations, 2 bots on the same network. And you'll see in total there are just under 400, 200 per bot. You see the churn over time. Each day there are different connections. And it took about 3 or 4 days to find a common set of bots. There were 3 in common between these 2 over 7 days, but not at the same time. So just looking at those 2 appear, if you look at them for just a day or two, to be connected to 2 completely different networks. So trying to learn how many there are from just doing traffic analysis in a single point is almost useless. After about a month or so of observation, it did pop out an IRC session. This is the kind of thing that everybody's doing today, clear text IRC, command and control. The odd thing here, and these are actual commands, this is not obfuscated. Anybody recognize these 3 address ranges? D-Link, Linksys, and Netgear, commodity, access points, cable modems. So the attackers were actually scanning behind firewalls on local networks, which is rather interesting. And they're telling the hosts which binary to download, choosing the exploit that they're going to use, and then also randomly choosing 10 buddies from your AIM list and then sending them an instant message. And during that one period of time when that IRC session was active, we can see 213 responses to the LSASS exploit, and it'll identify what operating system was exploited. So I don't know if that was a one-for-one compromise and increase of new bots, but you can see the effect there. And again, trying to just figure out how big is the botnet over time. This set was the set of IPs that I saw over a 48-day period. This set and this set represent 2 IRC sessions within 24 hours, lasted 2 minutes in one case, 34 minutes in another case. And the overlap is very, very small. So there is a much larger set of bots available, but early on we had absolutely no idea. There was no simple way to predict how big the network was. These are some examples of the commands I was talking about. Spread by AIM, randomly choose 10. That's the equivalent of what we just saw in the IRC session. This is the equivalent of the IRC session for scanning. These were done many, many months apart. Denial of service attacks and things were done with an infinite loop, which was interesting, and then they would use this scripts abort all to stop it. So there were several ways of controlling how much it's going to DOS. Just DOS them forever until I tell you to quit. Do it for a certain amount of time. They would use random number generation with a probability of 1 in 100. Sleep for, I think that is 4 hours. 1.6 million milliseconds, do the math. So tell everybody in the network who's available at that time with a 1% probability, if you happen to be in that 1%, wait a while, and then give me your keylog files. So you're not going to have a denial of service attack on the keylogger. And there will be this latency for the event, which will mean it's not going to be easy to say, this was the command coming in, this was the action taking place. Looking at the propagation, I mentioned that there were 5 mechanisms for propagation being used. Here is the scanning activity using the local network, and port 445 was being scanned for. Then you see a switch here. A feature was added to actually determine what is the local network address. Now just go scan that address. So rather than assuming that you're behind a commodity device using a default block, use the local network address. Then, well, now let's start scanning randomly. Then you see the scanning stop for the most part, except for one outlier, right about the same time that they start moving towards this AOL journal post that I'll talk about in a minute, and using a download aggregator. So you can, in this case, see the shift in tactics. I still don't know exactly what the effects are, which method is most effective. But in this case, this is very similar to Storm as well. A posting made on an AOL journal, and if you click on this link, now what I'm showing you here, I don't know if this is exactly the same malware, but this is the same tactics being used to propagate some malware. 5 graphical components, some JavaScript, and some HTML, and some PHP. So these 5 elements, it looks like a media player that looks like it's trying to play, but it's not doing anything. So they construct a page with the media player, delay for 5 seconds or whatever, and then use the other graphical components with JavaScript to include the name of whatever it is that you say is missing. And if you click on continue, then the PHP script downloads a copy of the binary to your browser. You then run it, and I did this on my Mac, so you're not going to see the same thing you'd see on a Windows machine. But you want to run this unsigned app? Well, the operating system just told me I was missing something, so yes, I do. And when you run it, it says, missing DLL or whatever. Talk to your system administrator. So if you're trying to look at a video of Saddam Hussein alive on work time, are you going to go talk to your system administrator and tell them that there's a missing DLL and help me fix this? No. So it's a fairly good social engineering attack. For this particular one, I got it through email. I believe this was Storm propagation. That's the same name that has been used for Storm propagation. Run it through VirusTotal, nothing found. 3 months later, run it through VirusTotal. Now we're up to 33% detection. So even the AV industry for years has been saying, we can't catch everything. These things change too fast. So you can't rely on that as a mechanism to protect you 100%. So here's this indirect propagation mechanism, and this is pretty interesting. So you take a public domain program that's fairly popular, and you pull the archive apart, Trojan the setup.exe program so that it will infect the computer, put it back in the archive, take the archive and you put it on a server somewhere, and you set up a domain so that people can go there with DNS. You create a fake web service. In this case, there was a mirror of tinyURL. And if you go to this web page and you enter the data, you get your tinyURL because it directs you to tinyURL. It's just a direct mirror of it. They then went to a download aggregator site and said, there is a mirror of this public domain piece of software sitting on this server. And then they go to the botnet and tell the bots to download whatever this thing is a couple of times, delay for a little while, do it a few more times, do it a little bit harder the next day, keep doing it, until it bumps it up to the #1 most popular download on the site, and kept it there for a couple of months. And the site says virus checked, spyware checked, guaranteed free. And yeah, if you run the archive through antivirus it doesn't detect anything. If you unpack the archive and then run all the constituent files through AV, the setup.exe is recognized by one engine out of all the ones that VirusTotal support. So that, I have no idea how many people were affected by that. It was taken down eventually. Through reverse engineering, we were able to figure out how to connect to the network and do something similar to Brandon Enright, who was analyzing Storm. And you run this tool, and again, I apologize, you can't see this very well, but the top line here is the footprint of the network, the number of hosts that they all know about as being connectable. So the servants, the hosts that you can talk to, not behind firewalls. This line here represents the set of hosts that are reported to be actively connected to the bots that we're talking to. And then the bottom line is the set of bots that we can talk to. And it starts out at just above 2,000 on average, going up at the end of this week to 2,500 or so on average. So something was going on during this period of time to make the botnet grow, or at least appear to grow. We're not certain about this yet. And we then repeated this experiment a little bit later, and somewhere in this period of time was the last time that I saw a command go through the network. So it's been degrading over time with a fairly interesting curve. And I've shown this graph to some people over time, and they said, well, you see these little dips down here? What are these little dips? And it wasn't really obvious at first until we started seeing, well, it actually looks like it's happening at a pretty regular period. They happen to occur a big dip on the second Wednesday of every month and a slightly smaller dip on the second Thursday of every month, except for September. September was a light patch Tuesday that didn't require a rebooting of hosts. So unless you were running certain versions of, I think, Windows 2003 or 2000, it wasn't necessary to reboot. So what we're noticing here is the effect of hosts that are doing automatic patching, or that somebody decides they're going to patch. And then it just attenuates out that graph that Rich was showing the other day. So we're still looking at this to try and verify it and quantify it, but it looks pretty obvious that that's the effect of Patch Tuesday. So a certain percentage of bots stop and restart because of this reboot. The rest of them don't. So that will be an interesting thing. The attacker could conceivably learn which bots or which hosts are being patched versus the ones that aren't being patched by looking carefully at the data. This is the graph. Actually, two graphs. One done by the German HoneyNet project right around Christmas time last year. And this is the section of the Storm network using the encryption key. And you'll see that it's not much larger than Nugache was until they start doing some heavy propagation around Christmas time, and you see the curve go up significantly. Brandon Enright did some studies, and he's showing roughly the same number of hosts that we were seeing for Nugache. So Storm, you've seen these reports of 50 million hosts, not all at once, and because of dynamic addressing, there's a massive overcount. I'm estimating probably 2 orders of magnitude overcount. Microsoft, I forget the figures, but they released some Patch Tuesday or MSRT results showing several hundred thousand, at least 200,000 or 300,000 per month of cleanup of Storm over the past few months. So those numbers are more realistic than the 1 to 50 million. Looking geographically during that period of enumeration, it's clear that English-speaking areas of the United States and Western Europe tend to be the most heavily populated, but you see infections, the rest of the world around in smaller numbers. We're still trying to figure out good ways of looking at the structure, and we thought, well, okay, we've got this enumeration data that shows which peers are connected to which peers, so let's graph it with GraphViz. Yeah, so tell me which one of these is the attacker, and when they connect and propagate a command, where are they? Who is the attacker? I still don't know. I still can't quite figure out who is controlling this or who may have been controlling it. The hosts that are in red here are the ones that were up and accessible during the entire second enumeration run. So that 10-day period, there were 190-something hosts that every time that I went out and looked, I could connect to them, they would talk to me. So they show up in red. If you bring it down to just the hosts that have 9 or more clients connected to them, you can actually start to see the structure a little bit better. And it's just little random clusters. There are no apparent supernodes in this structure. And the red nodes that are the always up nodes do not seem to be forming any kind of a central core. This is there's a limit. They try to limit to 10 clients connected. Now you see the structure a little bit better, and it is approximately 23 hops from one edge of this cloud to the other edge. So you inject the command with a certain TTL, the command gets propagated to all the currently connected peers, it keeps moving around. They use a nonce, so if it happens to get a loop like you can see here, you see the command once, you execute it. You see it again, you just drop it, and you don't forward it. So that's the way that peer-to-peer networks propagate. This, for comparison, is the Nutella network, and you can see that there are obvious nodes that have a much higher in degree. Those would probably, I'm guessing, be the DSL alt-up hosts that tend to accumulate people looking for files. The ones that have very few connections are probably the dial-ups or DHCP, your laptop moving from one network to another network, and it's only available for a short period of time. So this kind of a structure, you'd have a much better chance of taking it out or taking out a good chunk of it by removing that host and that host. You don't have that same benefit with Nugache because of the randomness. The Nugache network really hasn't been used for too much. I showed some of the scanning. There were a few denial of service attacks that were seen. The most interesting one was 2 weeks before Valentine's Day last year, 3 online jewelry stores were hit, or one was targeted, but the tool didn't do it right, so it didn't actually send any packets out, a little bug. The other 2 worked. The download count pumping of the Trojan installer, and then a lot of retrievals of keystroke log files. So the biggest threat to this thing really is the fact that it sort of stays under the radar, is quietly operating, some of them are constantly up, and you can just ask them for full key log file. AIM has been used for command and control, at one point sending the connect count to an AIM user NIC, so using that as a feedback mechanism rather than the peer-to-peer command and control. And it also has the ability to open a SOX proxy, and that was one of the last things that was witnessed. Password-protected SOX proxy. So for the public, the implications are, if it wasn't obvious already, the entire internet is a hostile zone, no matter where you're at. You go into a wireless cafe, they happen to use default addressing schemes, and one of the hosts is infected, and now it's scanning locally and infecting whoever is vulnerable. Free download sites, I wouldn't be as trusting of stuff that I get off of download sites anymore. You've seen blogs, email, instant messaging, all used as vectors to try and send stuff out. And the fact that IDS and IPS and AV, anything that's signature-based, is fairly easily defeated means you can't rely on that as a single means of protection. So now layered security, defense in depth, is going to mean combining these things in ways that if one fails, something else hopefully will pick it up. And then trying to keep up with that by using slightly more advanced techniques is another way to deal with it. From the perspective of somebody trying to do incident response, the harder it is to see the network, the longer it's going to last, the harder it's going to be to mitigate it. So we're going to have to start doing distributed collaborative response in a different way, sharing information using something like IMDF, which is a standard for incident data interchange, so that you can get a trusted bit of information from someone else who's affected, correlate it fairly quickly with data that you have on your site to try and get this bigger picture. And there's a lot of research that can be done there. A lot of tools need to be developed. For people who are network operators, a lot of times you just want to get the box cleaned up. It's a pain to talk to customers. It's expensive to talk to customers. But if you just do a wipe and reinstall and you just go and take out the command and control in an IRC channel, does that stop it? Often it doesn't. It just forces them to move someplace else. So collecting some data and being able to use it, especially making sure that you have complete and accurate information. What time zone, what date. Unix syslog, for example, doesn't put the year in. It just says the day, month and day. And what's the clock skew? If the clock's off by 24 hours and you send somebody a report and they go try and look up a ISP dynamically assigned user, they get the wrong one. So you have to have very accurate information to do this. Because of things like fast flux DNS, where you've got DNS records that point to other records and those have short times to live, and so the mappings change continuously, record the DNS mapping to the IP address at the time that you look at it to make sure that you've got that information as well. And then, I've already said this effectively, put the data collection at the same priority as taking these things down. So to conclude, it's looking like as soon as these peer-to-peer techniques become more widely used, Storm is a pretty good proof of concept. Nugache is a really good proof of concept. I didn't go into it here, but in the paper on the emergence of these peer-to-peer botnets, there have been about 5 examples going back about 4 years. And there are at least 5 peer-to-peer file sharing networks, anonymous file sharing networks that I know of, that use RSA or Diffie-Hellman key exchange and then use AES at high bit sizes. So there are a lot of people out there working on these problems, which means all malware is going to start moving to this at some point. So just to repeat, we were doing reverse engineering similar to what Bruce was talking about. He mentioned it's a valuable thing. I can't stress that enough. So if you don't have people on staff who can do this kind of thing, trying to find people who can is good, or feeding it to companies like Microsoft who have teams of people doing it is good. And just trying to find command and control and take it out, what we're doing today with botnets, is going to become less and less effective over time because the command and control is the network. The infection, or the network itself becomes the stepping stones. It becomes the command and control. So trying to then start identifying peers and being able to get your hands on the malware, being able to analyze the malware, being able to correlate things becomes more important. So as the attackers improve their skills, we've got to improve ours just as much. So with that, just want to say thanks to some people who helped out here. Sven Dietrich at Stevens Institute of Technology. We co-authored the first book on distributed denial of service. And John Hernandez, who was at UW Tacoma helping me with reverse engineering a year or so ago. He's since graduated and gone off. And Sam Stover, the 4 of us were involved in the 2 articles I mentioned earlier. And thanks again to Bruce for helping out here as well. So, questions? Are we running over time and making somebody else wait outside? And back.
Does the origination point of a botnet command, does that look like any other peer-to-peer node? Like, does it receive commands as well, or does it look like it takes receiving commands?
Yeah, the question is, does the commands coming into the network look the same or different from just regular peer-to-peer communication? The answer is it does look different. The problem is you've got to do some fairly sophisticated traffic analysis, usually manually, to try and identify it. We're working on some ways, and I have some theories of how we can do flow-based signature detection to differentiate command and control, the injection of a command versus the propagation of a command, or just a peer connecting, doing an update, and then getting offline. There's no static signature that you can go off of because of the fact that they're doing the key exchange and using individual session keys.
Your paper had a control connection going through like a couple of anonymous proxies or something, and then getting into the cloud.
Yeah.
If the command had looked like part of the cloud, that would be more difficult to track.
Yeah.
It just looked like another picture.
Yeah, it does. Oh, come on, Mac. Yeah. Because of the fact that you got the cloud, you've got commands being relayed between peers, you should be able to identify the attacker connecting just because of latency and other things like that. But again, the more you describe how to detect it, the more that you can have a countermeasure, padding, delays in timing. There's all kinds of things. So, oh, there we go. So yeah, in this diagram, I'm showing the stepping stones here just for similarity between these three structures. They don't need these stepping stones anymore. Or if they do use the stepping stones, it could be just one proxy to connect to any one of these and then issue the command, and then it goes through the big virus ball. So it is going to be much more difficult. And people will say, okay, well, you said there's TTLs. Can you monitor through the TTLs and try and figure out where it came from? Well, maybe, maybe not. But then you've got to have multiple observation points to be able to triangulate. So this is going to be a very interesting problem to solve. Put it that way. Question?
I think I missed something in how you were tracking the P2P part. How were you able to track the part of the cloud that was outside of your network visibility?
Okay, the question was, how did we track the cloud that was outside of our visibility? The graphs that I was showing of the population, is that what you're talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah, the population graphs were determined using a technique similar to Brandon Enright, where you use a client that's able to connect and then can issue some commands. We were asking for, specifically in this case, I don't even want to try to fast forward there, who's connected to you, how many do you know about, what version are you running?
So you're actually able to propagate your own command through the cloud?
Not propagate our own command through the cloud, but to go out and connect to bots, ask them questions, get some responses, and then graph based on the results.
But that request to a bot is something that's built into the bot, or something that you're
Yeah.
able to...
Yeah, we're faking a bot, basically.
Okay.
And the other observations are made through traffic analysis, and like I was saying, you get a limited view, so you have to kind of correlate the two, which gets back to what Bruce was saying about trying to do rapid reverse engineering to understand what it is you're looking at so that you can kind of infer what you're seeing on the wire. You can't see the commands because they're encrypted, but you've got the bot, so if you do enough reverse engineering, you can kind of infer what it may be doing. Question over here.
You said the last command was issued around August 2007. Is this thing just sitting here dormant?
It appears to be, yeah, and I have no idea why. And I don't even want to try and speculate, but it could have moved off. I mean, I wasn't hiding very much, so they could have detected I was watching. Who knows? But yeah, there's no command that I've seen has gone through since then, and the graph shows a smooth decline. So it appears, but it appears to be relatively stable where it's at. So. Other questions?
Another question, I guess. So how good is current detection then for IDS signatures, and are people able to track this at all through any leading edge sigs or things like that?
Question is, how well can this be detected using current AV or bleeding edge snort kind of signatures? I don't know of any effective IDS signatures that are out there. There are some AV samples. Actually did have a slide on that, but let's see if I can. Oh, come on, I thought if I backed up it would... Yeah, it's not letting me show it. I ran a few samples through AV in December of 2006 using samples that were I can't even read it, 3, 6, and something else number of months. And there were a few engines that detected it because they detected that it was packed with something that they didn't know what the packer was. So it was suspicious. And there were a few positive IDs. I had given some samples to Microsoft, so their engine caught it. A couple of AV companies had detected in May timeframe. There were several analyses that were done. So the groups that were sharing information had signatures for that variant. But since it was packed with an unknown packer, if you're just going off straight signatures, it may not be as easily detectable. So some of the engines stopped detecting it. And the ones that said it was suspicious always said it was suspicious as just a general, you know, this is weird, but we don't know why or what it is. So, and of course, all the AV companies who I talked to said, yeah, can you send me samples? So if you're just going after samples to try and have a signature, you're always reacting and you're always going to be behind the curve. And when I was talking at ISD in Chicago, I was talking about another bot, a variant of Rhizo, which is a standard IRC bot, which was packed 3 times. So run it through a standard packer, then do some obfuscation so that there's an in-memory injection of the second unpack, and then pack the resulting binary. So with that many levels of compaction and then altering an array of 256, I think it was, NICs in very subtle ways, you can just have a make file that regenerates the binary with absolutely no changes whatsoever, and the hash of the first packing changes, the hash of the second packing changes, hash of the third packing changes. So there are many techniques that have been talked about for years to bypass AV. No other questions? All right, well, thank you all.
If you guys have a blue form, please make sure to fill it out and leave it on the table over here.
Yeah. Yes. Lunch. Yeah, some of the more interesting conversations I don't want to have on a recording.